Hi, everybody. It's Chelsea again. We're about to get started today with our kind of event for today, Paging Through History, where I'm going to be talking about a book. Looks like this table that we got here is a little unstable, so hopefully it won't shake the whole time, but we shall see. I'm going to post this video on our events page so that everybody knows where to find it. So let's see. There we go. And then I am going to do a little bit of other stuff, make sure that we are looking good. Okay. All right, so it is right at 12 o'clock. Thank you for everybody who is joining us. I'm going to give people a little bit of time to pop in. If you guys are excited for this, please, tell me who you are down below or on the side in the comments. Let me know a little bit about who's here. Share this with your friends on Facebook Live or share it out on Twitter or anything like that. I'm hoping the video quality might be a little bit better today, but it's an experiment and we're still kind of working on it. So it seems like, I can't tell, I'm going to watch myself. There we go. Okay, so just to reiterate, my name is Chelsea Gibson. I am a PhD. I got my PhD from Binghamton a little while back. If anybody who's watching the live stream, my video keeps doing a blank. So if you could tell me, does the video seem kind of odd to you? I know there's a little bit of a lag. So if anybody could let me know in the comments if the video seems okay, that would be super helpful, just so I know what's going on. I'm going to text my husband too to see if he could check the video. Hi, Harriet. I see your message. Thanks for joining. Okay, very good. All right, video looks good. Thank you, Shane. I appreciate your feedback. Okay, so let's see. It's 12:02. So I am not sure how long we are going to go today. I have a lot I can say about the book that I wanted to talk about today because I did an entire dissertation chapter on it. So I know a lot about this topic and I'm super excited to share it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about the conceit of this kind of program this online kind of digital program that we've devised, and tell you a little bit about what we've got coming up before we kind of get started. So again, hello, my name's Chelsea. I'm excited to see everybody. I'm hoping to do a couple more digital events coming up. You'll hopefully see me a lot on Facebook Live, either me or Joe, our indefatigable house manager. So if you guys can see behind me, I've got a little bit, one part of our library here. I'm actually sitting beside a beautiful fireplace over here. Got this beautiful mantle. We've got the rest of the library over there. Lots and lots and lots of books. And we thought it would be really fun to kind of take one library out of this book every couple of weeks and talk a little bit about its origins. So the library that I'm sitting in obviously was originally part of the Phelps Mansion when it was created in 1871. It was the home of Sherman David Phelps. For anybody who isn't familiar with the mansion, we're located in downtown Binghamton, New York. But the books that we actually have in the library didn't belong to the Phelps family because the Phelps family actually died pretty close together. So the mansion was completed in 1871, and then in 1878, Sherman Phelps, the kind of patriarch, he passed away. Then his youngest son died, his eldest son died, and then his daughter-in-law died. So they all died within 3 or 4 years. His daughter-in-law, Hattie, died in 1882. So that's 4 years. They all kind of kicked the bucket, and that may be an insensitive phrase, but they all passed away. And so basically everything in the house was sold off, either given to family or put up for auction. Phelps came from actually a pretty large family, but it doesn't seem like anybody in his amongst his like kind of close family really wanted to take over the house or what have you. So we literally only have one set of books that was ever owned by somebody who lived in this house. And that's because we had a guest come by a couple years ago who realized he had just like happened to buy the books at an auction sale or something like that. So we have literally one collection of Nathaniel Hawthorne's books, and that's it. Everything else in this library was either purchased or donated by women who were members of the Monday Afternoon Club. That was a women's kind of reading club, or it was an activity club, really. I'll talk a little bit more about them in a second. So the books were either owned by the Monday Afternoon Club or they were owned by the architect of the house, Isaac Perry. We actually have the bookshelves that I have behind me. As far as we understand it, were installed after Isaac Perry, the architect, died, and he donated them to this mansion. So the library itself is kind of a collage or kind of hodgepodge of books from the club, of books from Isaac Perry, and then like one very small collection of books that we actually have from the Phelps. So between these, we have a really incredible collection of books. Some of them are kind of about Binghamton. So we have some first edition books. For example, we have one about the inebriate asylum that was up on the hill for a long time. Well, it remains there, but isn't in use anymore. And then we have all these great books that were collected by the Women's Club. So we have literature, we have travel logs, we have like political memoirs, we have lots of different things. And so me being a historian, an avid reader of books, a bibliophile, if you will, I thought it would be a lot of fun to start kind of digging through our collection and like bringing you guys into the library. So I wanted to tell you just a little bit more about the Monday Afternoon Club. Because the book that I'm going to be talking about today, Siberia and the Exile System by George Kennan, this is a first edition of this book, and it was definitely purchased by the Monday Afternoon Club because it actually has a label of the Monday Afternoon Club in it. And if you can see here, we've got the date over here on the side, that is 1890. So the Monday Afternoon Club was a women's club that was founded in 1890. They didn't actually move to the Phelps Mansion until 1904. But up until that time, they would meet typically on Monday afternoons, and they would talk about lots of things. You can actually see it in this beautiful little label that they have here. So we've got music, we've got drama, we've got the arts, and we've got literature. And so the Phelps Mansion Museum has really carried on that tradition. We have chamber concerts pretty regularly that our interim executive director, Toby Jean Manker, she puts together really great programs in that vein. We have plays that come through here. We've actually had a couple of plays that actually like wind through the house. So there's been like fake dead bodies in the library where I'm sitting from a Clue, kind of interactive Clue thing that we did a couple years ago. We put on history programs, we do education, we regularly put art up for First Fridays. So the Monday Afternoon Club gave us a really great legacy that has helped make the Phelps Mansion Museum, has helped create our mission, and we've really become a great humanities center as a result of that. But so the Monday Afternoon Club is really the reason that we have most of these books, just because they were a women's club developed in the late 19th century. And a lot of times, this is in what was known as the Progressive Era, or like the very beginnings of the Progressive Era. And so women really believed that educating themselves, kind of contributing to society, doing these types of kind of self-education reading groups was a way to really help improve the nation and improve themselves. So we have a lot of really interesting books. They would bring doctors to come through to talk about the latest like theories about insanity. They would have people come here and talk about immigration. We had Carrie Chapman Catt, who was a really famous suffragist, come through. We even had like Amelia Earhart came through in 1935, just a couple of years before she died. So we have a lot of really, really interesting books. So to start off, I guess, to tell you a little bit about why I chose this book today for us to talk about. Again, it's called Siberia and the Exile System, and it was published in 1891. So it was published just a year after the Monday Afternoon Club was founded. And I chose this book largely because I know a lot about it, and I thought that that would make this a particularly interesting talk. I did, my dissertation is on the relationship between Americans and Russians before the Bolsheviks, basically before 1917. I look at the way that Americans interacted with Russian revolutionaries, and that's basically what George Kennan did. So I think we're going to have a lot of fun. This book is really important. It was actually known by its contemporaries as the Uncle Tom's Cabin of the Siberian exile system. And if you're not familiar with Uncle Tom's Cabin, that was a really, really, really influential book that was published in the 1850s by an Ohio woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe. And it really helped kind of inflame a lot of tensions in the American Civil War, because she kind of exposed the really negative kind of living conditions of American slaves. Not that people didn't know that existed, but it just became one of those books that kind of captures the zeitgeist, really grabs people, and really instigated a lot of change and a lot of conflict in the United States. And this book basically did the same exact thing. So it's going to be a really cool thing to talk about. I'm sure when you guys think of Russia, you think of Stalin, you think of Putin, or you think of the Gulag system, right? So that's fine. You also probably think of snow. Those are all fine. But today we're going to be talking about a Russia that you probably are a little bit less familiar with, although there are some kind of familiar elements. So today the Russia that we're going to be talking about that is in this book is a Russia of the 19th century. So just to set the stage, I'm sorry, my camera is moving. Just to set the stage a little bit, this is a Russia that still has the Tsar. This is a Russia that has only recently abolished serfdom. So Russia actually abolished serfdom in 1861, 2 years before we abolished serfdom. We abolished slavery in the Confederacy, basically in 1863, and then outlawed it via the 13th Amendment in 1865. This is a Russia that is huge, spread out, very populated. The all Russian census are all kind of the census of the Russian Empire that was done, I think, in 1890, right around the time this book came out, said that they had over 100 million people that spoke about 120 different languages. So this is a Russia in some ways that you can kind of imagine as a mirror image of the United States. In the 19th century, a lot of people looked at the United States and looked at Russia, and they said, these are going to be the countries that determine the fate of the next century. Because both America and Russia had huge lands with indigenous peoples, that a lot of people considered empty or full of natural resources. They had a polyglot population. They had a multi-ethnic population. One thing that's important to remember about Russia is that it borders Central Asia, it borders Manchuria, right? It has these cultures that are all the way on the Bering, like close to the Bering Strait, right? So you have a lot of these indigenous peoples that in some ways are kind of similar to the indigenous people over in Alaska. And so this is a Russia that in the 19th century was still very unknown. Nobody spoke Russian in the 19th century. A lot of people spoke French and German, but very few people spoke Russian. And Russia just was this kind of enigma. It remains an enigma, but there are a lot more YouTube videos about Russia now, where if you really wanted to learn something, you could. Back then, it was just this kind of fabled land, and people didn't quite know what to think about it. And so the reason that this expose that I'm gonna get talking about very quickly, the reason why it's a really important book is that in the 19th century, there was a debate amongst a lot of observers of Russia. So Russia is this kind of interesting country because the country itself straddles two continents. It straddles the European continent and it straddles kind of the Asian continent, right? And so Russia literally lies like half in Europe and half in Asia. And so the eternal question about Russia is it a Western nation or is it an Eastern nation? And of course, this is a arbitrary kind of designation. Like there is no true Western nation or Eastern nation. That's a cultural concept, right? But it nevertheless was very important in the 19th century. And one of the biggest questions was, were Russian people kind of primed to accept autocracy? This is still a debate we kind of have now. Our Russian people were the people of the Russian Empire, which included, not just what we would call like ethnic Russians, but, you had Poles, you had Ukrainians, you had Belarusians, you had people in Manchuria, you had indigenous peoples of Siberia, like the Kyrgyz, or the Kyrgyz are actually in Central Asia, kind of lower, but you have like all of these different types of people, right? And it seemed like the Tsar of Russia, who literally was an autocrat, right? He controlled everything. He controlled the land. He controlled the people. Anything that they dug up in a mine was technically his property. He controlled the church. There was no civil liberty there were no civil liberties in Russia at this time. There basically were no juries for most of the 19th century. Did not vote. You could not have free assembly. You would have to get official permission from the Tsar to organize anything. And so people often talked about Russia like it was this frozen place of a bunch of people totally cowed by the autocracy. And this was especially true of the peasants. When I read kind of primary sources about Russia from this time period, people often talk about the Russian peasantry like they're cattle, like literally they call them animals. And so the idea was that this is a frozen landscape. That's how people imagined it. Like not just the fact that it literally is cold there a lot of the time, although the sun does shine in Russia and there are beautiful springs and summers and autumns. But people really thought like this is a place where people don't fight back because they're naturally suited to oppression. They're naturally suited to autocracy. This has to do a little bit with what scholars call an Orientalist lens, where people in the 19th and still 20th century viewed people from the East as kind of frozen, kind of stuck in time, not dynamic, right? Not the kind of dynamism that you would think of like in the impression of like maybe an American cowboy, this kind of rugged individual. They really saw these people as passive. And so what this expose did was not only demonstrate the kind of terrible situation of people who were exiled to Siberia under the Tsar's regime, but Kennan also revealed a bunch of people who were Russian revolutionaries who weren't violent per se, but they had started agitating, spreading propaganda, trying to get civil liberties, and they would be sent to Siberian exile too. And so George Kennan helped kind of show the world that Russians weren't passive. They weren't just taking this oppression because it was natural to them. They were fighting it too, right? And so it kind of helped people see themselves, like especially Americans, helped Americans see themselves as these kind of Siberian exiles. And this book kind of single-handedly created a humanitarian crusade. Or this book and George Kennan's writings more generally, because he actually published basically everything in this book. And this is just one volume. We actually don't have the first volume. We just have the second volume. But between these two volumes, it's almost 1,000 pages. And he had published these in a magazine that was called The Century Magazine. It was one of the most popular magazines in the entire country at the time. So he published it in that magazine, and then it got published in this book. But basically, it ignited a humanitarian crusade and really transformed the way that Americans thought about Russia, to the point that a lot of the kind of ideas about Russia that we still hold, got kind of translated into our discourse on the USSR, and then it got translated into our discourse today on Putin's America. We still kind of ask the same questions, have some of the same assumptions, kind of expect the same things from Russian people. This really set a lot of, I guess, stereotypes as well about the kind of callousness of the Russian Empire, about how bad, the leader of Russia can be, about how autocratic he can be, about how kind of oppressive the system can be. This is like a foundation for all of that. So I just want to let you guys know again, I'm always happy to answer any questions. So if you have any questions, please type them in the kind of comments and I will address them as they come up. But what I wanted to do was first talk a little bit about George Kennan. Because he's a really interesting guy. And I wanted to show you a picture of him that I've got on my phone. So George Kennan was an American. He was born in 1854 in Ohio. And he ended up actually dying in New York State. He lived in Medina, New York for quite a lot of time. And he also did a lot of traveling throughout his life. But his wife, who he ended up marrying in like the late 1870s, she was from Medina. And so that was a place that he often kind of stayed. So he's actually kind of he's not a native son, but he is from upstate New York, which is kind of cool. So Medina, if you don't know, is kind of halfway between Rochester and Niagara Falls. So it's way over in Western New York. But this is a picture of George Kennan. You can find this on the Library of Congress. This is kind of a low-tech thing because I don't have a lot of things. I can't share my screen or something like that right now. But if you notice, this is a picture of George Kennan, and he is in the outfit of a Siberian exile. This picture was taken after he returned from his third trip to Russia in 1880. He was there from 1885 to 1886. And this was actually an outfit that he would wear when he was touring to talk about the things that he had found in this book. And if you notice, he's got leg fetters here. Those are chains connected to his feet that are wrapped around his torso. He's got kind of the hat of an exile. He's got this long coat, and he's got kind of the basic exile getup, which is just like a large shirt over some kind of linen or maybe cotton pants there. He would wear this oftentimes. He would come out in these chains, and imagine the kind of sensation somebody would cause by coming out literally shackled. So this is George Kennan. So one of the things I wanted to talk about first is that he is a different George Kennan than some of you guys might have heard of before. You've probably heard of George Frost Kennan of the 20th century. He was a Soviet expert. He was actually related to this George Kennan. He was his second cousin. So George Frost Kennan was the grandson of George Kennan's cousin. It's kind of confusing. They only met once. I actually read in George Kennan's papers that are stored in the New York Public Library that he left a lot of his Russia stuff to George Frost Kennan. Anyway, I just wanted to point out that those are two different people. But George Kennan's really interesting because he was born kind of a poor kid from Ohio, like I said, in 1854. And he ended up starting to work at the age of 12, which is not unusual. Sherman Phelps, actually, who was born in 1814, he started working very young as well. I think he started working at 12 or 13 in a glass factory. So working at 12 was pretty common back then. But he started working in the telegraph company. And this is something that would fundamentally change his life and bring him to Russia. Like, this is the reason he ends up being able to write anything about the Russian Empire and the Siberian exile system. And that's because after he first worked for some local telegraph companies in Ohio. Then during the American Civil War, he worked for the Military Telegraph Corps in the Union Army and got more experience there. And then in 1864, he was hired by the Russian American Telegraph Company, or the Russian American Expedition. And in 1865, he ended up getting on a ship from San Francisco and setting off to help basically lay a telegraph line across the Bering Strait, basically I think it was from San Francisco to Moscow. So the idea was that he was going to go on this expedition and help scout out land, help prepare the kind of burying of these lines, kind of work with the native populations, things like that. And they were going to get a telegraph line from San Francisco, go all the way up the coast, across the Bering Strait, through Siberia, all the way to Moscow, right? And Russia is a big place. Like, that is 4,000 to maybe even 6,000 miles across the Russian kind of country there. And so that's how he first went to Russia. In 1865, he arrived in kind of the very, very, very northeastern tip of Russia, right there on the Bering Strait. And he started laying this telegraph line. And in the process, he learned Russian. He was there working with Russian kind of agents of the Russian Empire. He also lived among a lot of the indigenous peoples there as well. So he learned a lot about especially Central Asian people and the kind of indigenous peoples that lived on the border between Manchuria, or that kind of part of China, and the Russian border. It's along the Amur River, actually, there. And so he is there. He's building this telegraph line. He's learning Russian. But one of the things that was happening simultaneously is that they were trying to fix the transatlantic telegraph line that went underneath the Atlantic Ocean. And so while Kennan is over here in Russia, that line over the Atlantic gets completed first, and they abandon the project over there in Russia, even though they had already laid and kind of surveyed the entire scope of the telegraph line and already laid a good number of miles. And so in his biography, there's actually a story of like the telegraph line selling those glass kind of coverings that you would put on the telegraph. They sold those as little teacups to the local population, trying to like make back any of their investment. It was something like $50 million today, and they lost almost all of the money. But anyway, so he was in Russia. He continued to travel around the Russian Empire. And when he got back to the United States, he wrote a book called Tent Life in Siberia. And it was a travelogue. He published this in 1870. And it was just kind of, it wasn't political. It didn't say really anything about the Tsar or the Siberian exile system. He didn't talk about that at all. It was just a travel kind of book. And it talked about the local population. It had illustrations, things like that. But he had definitely gotten a bug and was really excited and thrilled about about Russia. So he ends up going back to Russia a number of times in the 1870s. And then in 1882, he gives a lecture. I believe it was to the National Geographic Society or something like that. But he gives a lecture where he says, people who talk about the Siberian exile system are wrong. People say it's bad. People say it's evil. People say it's kind of inhumane. He says, I've been to Russia. I've been to St. Petersburg. I've been to Moscow. I've been across Siberia. I've never seen any of the horrors or any of the problems that people claim to be basically to exist in the Siberian exile system. And this particular talk gets a lot of press, and he gets a lot of people challenging him, saying like, that's a lie. I don't believe you. And George Kennan, who was a pretty indignant man, if you ever got on George Kennan's bad side, he would just excoriate you with words. He was an incredibly literate man. Oh man, I should have brought you an image of his handwriting. His handwriting is just like the most beautiful thing you've ever seen in your entire life. But he didn't like being told he was wrong. He was somebody who really valued like numbers and statistics and facts. Like if you wrote in an editorial criticizing him, he would write back something that had like footnotes and citations and sources for extra reading. So when somebody said like, you're wrong, Siberian exile system is bad and you're a liar, he wasn't going to take that. So basically, he was given money by the Century magazine company. And they said, go back to Russia, investigate the Siberian exile system. We'll fund the whole expedition, and we'll publish your essays in our journal. So in 1885 to 1886, he goes back to Russia. And he goes back to Russia with a guy that he had met on that Russian-American telegraph expedition. His name was George Frost. He was an artist and a photographer. So he had somebody come with him who could make sketches, who could take photographs, and who ultimately provided all of the illustrations in the 2 volumes of this book and in the kind of article series. And they're beautiful and they're really evocative. And I shared a link on the event page to the Library of Congress kind of repository of some of these images that are free and available and digitized online. I would highly recommend you look at them because they're really interesting and really beautiful. And so he and George Frost go to Siberia. And what he ends up finding is that he is wrong. He becomes a convert, basically. And he meets tons and tons and tons of Siberian exiles. And he comes out and has a completely different story. And he says, the Tsar is bad, right? This system is corrupt. People are being sentenced to exile for no good reason. These are political prisoners. A lot of them are political prisoners out here. They are only being sentenced because they are trying to push back against the Tsar. They're trying to change Russia. They're trying to democratize Russia. And so he creates this basically like this crusade or this humanitarian cause against the Russian Empire, against the Tsar. And he becomes an enemy of the Tsar basically for the rest of his life. He's actually, he goes back to Russia once, but is basically run out of the country because originally the Tsar actually gave him permission to go to all of these exile colonies. He went to, so basically the Siberian exile system has a really old history. Some of the earliest kind of settlements were started in the 17th century, like the 1640s, 1650s. And by the 19th century, it was a more bureaucratic and administrative system. And it served a couple of purposes, just so that we understand it. One, you would send somebody out there to be convict labor. So Russia has a lot of natural resources, but those natural resources are underground. So you've got metal, so you've got iron, you've got silver, you've got tons of different types of ores. You've got obviously gas in some areas and oil. But basically, you would send convicts out to harvest those natural resources. So Kennan traveled to what was known as the Kara gold mines, which was like a really infamous mine there. He traveled to silver mines, things like that. You could also be sentenced to Siberian exile to be a kind of forced colonizer or a special, like, no, that's a Stalinist term, but you basically would be in penal servitude. You would have to go out there and just live, because the Tsarist government used the Siberian exile system as a way to colonize all of these lands kind of in its east. So again, it was full of indigenous peoples. There were people kind of like Central Asians. And there's just a lot of different people out throughout Siberia and kind of the lower area. And so the Tsarist government used these prisoners to settle and basically colonize that land. In the same way that in the 19th century, the United States sent out a lot of settlers, you know, with like 40 acres and a mule. You would do all of these land grants, especially after the American Civil War, to kind of displace indigenous Americans and kind of claim that property as part of the United States. So that was happening simultaneously in kind of the Russian Empire and in the American Empire. But so Kennan actually got permission to go to all of these places. The Tsar gave him the documents that he needed and approved all of this. And he worked with Russian officials or Tsarist officials. He got to interview over 500 Russian exiles who were there as political prisoners. He interviewed common convicts as well, but he wasn't as interested in them. He was really interested in the people who were exiled because they were political prisoners. And so he basically became really sympathetic with them. But the Tsar was quite upset that he had given all of this access to a man who then went out and said, "This guy sucks. We should dethrone him. He is a bad influence on Russia, and these people deserve freedom." The Tsar did not expect that, because Kennan's earlier writings had basically defended the Tsarist system. So one of the most iconic images of the Siberian exile system kind of book is this. And it says, the marching party of exiles passing a train of freight sleighs, basically. And so just look at this image. This kind of conveys human suffering. They're in kind of white blizzard deep in Siberia. These people are marching through the snow, trying to get to one of these Siberian one of these Siberian outposts, right? So basically, Russia is huge. And if you were sentenced to Siberian exile, you were often in European Russia. So there's a very clear demarcation where kind of European Russia starts and kind of Asiatic Russia begins. It's somewhere near Perm. And so if you were exiled to Siberia, you often lived kind of closer to Europe. And then you would walk. If you were a common criminal, you would walk 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 miles to get here. Right. And if you were a political prisoner, or the prison system kind of worked in a different way in the 19th century in Russia, because there were actually different punishments based on your social class. So if you were part of the aristocracy or the nobility, you would get different punishments than somebody who didn't have that type of family prestige. So if you were a lot of Russian revolutionaries in the 19th century, including Vladimir Lenin, who you're probably more familiar with, they came from the nobility. And so if they got sentenced to Siberian exile, they could ride in a wagon, or they could have, they basically had more provisions than the common criminal. But then nevertheless, you have to get all the way out there. And so I actually wanted to read an excerpt from George Kennan's book, where he talks about this moment where when you're walking from Western Russia and moving into Siberia, there's actually an obelisk. There's this big marker, like this big stone marker. And he talks about it in this book, and I actually have it here, and I wanted to read it. And he describes what it's like to see this boundary between Western Russia and Eastern Russia. And this is when people realize like they are leaving, and it's going to take a lot to get back home. People did escape from Siberian exile, but it was, you either died or you got back home. There wasn't a lot of in between. So I wanted to read this here, and it says, on the second day after our departure from Yekaterinburg, as we were passing through a rather open forest between the villages of Markova and Tugomilskaya, our driver suddenly pulled up his horses and, turning to us, said, "Vot, granitsa." He says, "Here is the boundary." We sprang out, and by the roadside, we saw standing a square pillar of 10 or 12 feet in height, stuccoed in plastered brick, bearing on one side the coat of arms of the European province of Perm, and on the other, the Asiatic province of Tobolsk. This was the boundary post of Siberia. No other spot between St. Petersburg and the Pacific is more full of painful suggestions, and none has for the traveler a more melancholy interest than the little opening of the forest where it stands, this grief-consecrated pillar. Here, hundreds of thousands of exiled human beings, men, women, children, princes, nobles, and peasants, have bidden goodbye forever to friends, their country, and their home. Here, standing beside the square white boundary post, they have, for the last time, looked backward with love and grief at their native land, and then, with tear-blurred eyes and heavy hearts, they have marched away to Siberia to meet the unknown hardships and the privations of a new life. So that is the way he kind of introduces the reader to entering this kind of Siberian system. And he, throughout this kind of excerpt, or throughout this entire book, he's very sympathetic, right? He writes in these kind of very flourishing phrases. I wouldn't say that he's a very sensationalistic writer, but what he's talking about is kind of sensational, and he wants you to see it. He wanted his readers, he wanted the Americans who read this book to get it. He wanted to them to understand the kind of people who were sentenced to Siberian exile, the kind of terrible situations that they would find themselves in. And he wanted people to act. He wanted people to kind of help transform this kind of system. And so one of the things I wanted to talk about as well is some of the people that he met along the way. I have a couple of things that are marked in this very, very big book. So one of the things that he did was that this takes a little bit of more historical context. So Russian revolutionaries in the 1880s in the United States were not viewed very well, as you can probably imagine. There was a terrorist wing that actually assassinated the Tsar in 1881. They built a big, beautiful cathedral where he was killed. It's called Spas na Krovi, or like the sacrifice of blood. And so these people had a really, really negative reputation. in the United States as murderers. People thought that they were fanatics. People thought that they were evil. And what George Kennan wanted to show was that not all Russian revolutionaries were violent fanatics. In fact, he wanted to show that Russian revolutionaries looked a lot like us, looked a lot like Americans, and looked a lot like kind of the progressive era thinkers that were starting to transform the United States at the time that he was writing this. So for example, he would want the women of the Monday Afternoon Club, who are cultured, who probably speak many languages, who were participating in their democracy, who were holding, discussions about politics, who were kind of talking freely and openly. He wanted those type of people to look at themselves and say, if I lived in Russia, I could be sent to Siberia, right? I would be considered a criminal. And that's partially, I argue, why he would wear the fetters of a Siberian exile, which, truth be told, if you were a political prisoner, you didn't necessarily have to wear this. This was more an outfit of a common criminal. But this is one of the reasons I think that he wore this outfit, because he wanted to shock you and make you think, oh, like, I could be in that. Like, what would my reaction be to being an exile? How could I kind of imagine myself in that way? And so one of the things he would do is he put a lot of images of the Siberian exiles that he met, who were in large part of the intelligentsia, part of the nobility, people who had very good reputations, things like that. So we've got this woman here, which I think is Elizaveta Kovalskaya. Yeah, if I'm not mistaken. And if you can see, she looks pretty smart, right? She smart in like a 19th century way. Like, she looks like she's very well dressed. And as you can see, she's kind of a woman of the nobility. And he would highlight women like this and men like this throughout this book to say, these people are cultured. These people know English. These people read our literature, right? These are people of our same culture. We should try to defend them. And so he tried to explain how people like this could actually become revolutionaries. Like, why would a noble woman who could just get married and just kind of live her life, like, what inspired her to work, like, to push back against the Tsar? And so what he would do is he would share these very, like, non-fanatic looking people's photographs, and he would then describe their life, right? So, for example, he talks about this woman, Elizaveta Kovalskaya, and he says, for example, that after trying again and again by peaceful and legal methods to remedy some of the evils of society that she saw about her, and after being opposed and thwarted at every step by the censorship of the press, by the secret police, and by the Russian bureaucratic system, she became satisfied that nothing could be done without a change in the existing form of government, and she therefore joined one of the secret revolutionary circles in Kiev. So this is the story that he would tell a lot of times in these books, is that people who turned to Russian revolutionary activity started off as good patriots, as good citizens, but let's say they wanted to improve the life of a former serf, and let's say they wanted to create a school. If you created a school and you started teaching the peasants, the secret police might start following your family. You might get an official kind of reprimand, or you might get sent to jail, right? And so what would happen is, if these people really believed and wanted to change the system, sometimes they would have to become what was known as nelegalny people, or like illegal people. They would literally have to kind of create a new identity, create a new passport, create new official documents, and go underground, because otherwise the Tsarist government would arrest them or arrest their families or kind of censor them in some way. And so that was one of the stories that George Kennan would often talk about in this book. I did want to bring up kind of an interesting / funny story from the book, or it's just one story that I just love because it's so bizarre. He only mentions it in the first volume, and it's just a sentence. But he talks about a bell that was actually exiled to Siberia. And this is actually a true story. I don't know if anybody has ever heard about this. But there was a bell in a town called Uglich in Russia. And basically what had happened was that Ivan the Terrible passed away, and he had 3 sons who could kind of take over his throne. The eldest one died. The middle one, therefore, was supposed to take over the country, but was kind of mentally incapable of doing so. So he had an advisor who basically ruled the country for him. So this older man wants to basically take control of Russia. And he already has control over that middle son. So he's like, okay, great. I'm just going to have to wait this kid out until he dies or until I murder him, and then I can take control. But the problem of the youngest son was like, well, what if he comes of age and then he could take control? So this man, his name was Godunov, he actually sent this young son of Ivan the Terrible, Dmitri, that was his name. He sent him to this town of Uglich, and he just wanted to keep him there, like just keep him there so that he doesn't make any trouble. But what ends up happening is Dmitri, this youngest son, dies suddenly, and the townspeople ring this bell to announce his death. It's basically like the death bell, the kind of ringing of the bell to let everybody know that he had died. And because everyone in town assumed that this kid had been assassinated, they started a riot. And they created all of this like commotion. There's a big unrest. And so this guy who wants to take control of Russia, this kind of person who's taking care of that middle son's power, he gets so upset about this that he actually orders the bell to be silenced. So they took out the ringer and he banished it to Siberia. So he literally banished the bell to Siberia, to Tobolsk, which is kind of far east in Siberia. And it sat there for 300 years. And it was the first inanimate exile to Siberia, which is just a delightful and kind of fun story. But again, that was a very small element of Kennan's book. He wanted to not entertain you. He wanted to make you feel bad in some cases. He wanted to inspire you to action. And one thing that's really interesting about George Kennan too, is that this book actually, when he was there, he actually really did befriend a lot of Russian exiles. So when you go and look at his papers, they're housed largely at the Library of Congress or the New York Public Library. And just like there are so many letters in Russian because all of these people, they met him, they learned about him, and then they would write to him and ask for his help. So there's this really interesting story about a man that he met while Kennan was in Siberia. And Kennan encouraged this guy. He said, write your biography. Write about yourself and get it to me, and I will kind of publish it. I will make it known in the West. And so Kennan leaves Siberia. He ends up in a different part of Russia. And one day he gets a parcel from Siberia. It doesn't have a name associated with it. And he gets this parcel. It's huge. It's heavy. And they unwrap it. And of course, the secret police first have to look at it. In the Tsar's system, the secret police basically checked the mail. They basically kept Kennan under wraps this whole time. They investigated him, anything that he brought out of the country. He kind of had to smuggle some of these things out. His photographer / artist friend, George Frost, actually had a mental breakdown because it was so stressful. Like knowing that the secret police were kind of always there, and it kind of made him a little paranoid. But anyway, so he gets this parcel. The secret police look it over and they're like, oh, it's just a tent. And the Kyrgyz people often use these kind of tents. That's one of the kind of structures or kind of living situations that they would have. And so he gets this bunch of tent material, and the police look it over and they see it and they're like, well, okay, I guess this is fine. And so Kennan knows this has to be from an exile, but he's not sure what it is. So he unravels it, and it's really thick. There's like a bunch of layers. It's like once you lay it out, it's like 100 feet of this tent material. And then he slowly starts to pull it apart, and he realizes that in between are these paper thin pieces of paper, just paper thin. And this Siberian exile, this man, wrote his biography and wrote about his experience in the exile system and smuggled it in this like really clever way. And scholars still use this as like a really good primary source because Kennan, of course, took it, preserved it, made sure that somebody knew about him. He really believed in kind of publicizing these people's experiences. There was a woman, for example, who committed suicide in one of the prisons to kind of protest her treatment. And Kennan was so upset. He talked about, in one of his letters, he basically said, like, the Tsar was not even fit to lick this woman's boots, and that he would do everything in his power to make sure that her life wasn't in vain. He would go out there and he would tell people and tell people and tell people. And that's exactly what he did. So between 1887 and in 1890, he ended up having a big lecture tour. And he honestly he talked to, or before, like, he would go to all of these events, and he probably talked to about 500,000 Americans. That's what his biographer estimates. And this is him, like, traveling all over the country. And he basically talked himself close to death. Like, he was really ill, and he had to take like a full summer off just to recuperate, because he would just work and work and work. But one thing that's really interesting, and this is a way that this book ties to the Phelps in another really cool way, is that his wife actually traveled to Russia with him in 1886. So he did this long kind of journey across eastern Russia, across eastern Siberia. And when he got back to European Russia, his wife Emmeline, which he called her Lena, or Lena, I'm assuming Lena, he met her there. And so she actually traveled around Russia with him and experienced some of these kind of connections with Russian radicals. Kennan was really close with a lot of Russian exiles who were actually, or I guess emigres is probably a better word, who lived in like Paris or London. And so his wife, Lena, actually met these people as well and knew a lot about the Russian situation too. Actually found a mention of her from the Good Housekeeping magazine of 1890. And it described all of the things that Lena did for him. So it says here, Mrs. Kennan, or Lena, is a great help to George Kennan in his work for the oppressed people of Russia. She recopies manuscript. She reads proofs. She translates Russian works. She goes over the receipts from his work and sees to their investment or deposit. Mrs. Kennan is described as a woman of considerable business tact and much personal attractiveness. So that is really interesting to me, because we don't actually know a lot about George Kennan's wife. We don't know a lot about Lena, because there are letters from them that are left over in the archives, but I, for example, have never seen a picture of her. I've been looking for many years, but I've never seen a picture of her. But she would often travel and talk about Siberia or talk about Russia as well. And she actually came to the Monday Afternoon Club and gave a talk in 1903. So that was before they actually were here. They were still in their old, they were in the Dwight House on Front Street. I don't know if anybody knows where that is. It's been torn down. But that's where they were housed from like 1890 to 1904 when they moved here. But I actually have the date book from the Monday Afternoon Club. They did the meeting minutes, and they talk about Lena Kennan. They talk about her. Of course, she's called Mrs. Kennan at this time period. And they have a little clip from the news from her. And one of the things that's really interesting, I'm going to pick you up and show you, and hopefully it will focus okay. If you will bear with me here. So this is one of the meeting minutes books, and it's going to shake a little bit. So I'm not going to read from it here. Oh, it's not going to focus. But anyway, this is the clipping. If you guys can see, it's like clipped out here. This is from 1903. So I'm just going to read that for a quick second, because I thought it's really cool. And I'm super excited that it's in our collection. So she came on April 20th, 1903. And you have to remember that Lena was from Medina, New York. That was her hometown. That's where her and George Kennan met each other. They eventually married in 1879. That's where he ended up dying. But anyway, so she was an upstate gal. So it probably wasn't too odd for her to travel to Binghamton. And George Kennan often traveled to New York City a lot, as you can imagine too. But it says, Mrs. Kennan wore red, white, and blue. Interesting talk on Russia before Monday Afternoon Club. Says Mrs. George W. Kennan, wife of the celebrated author on Russia, delivered an interesting lecture yesterday afternoon before the members of the Monday Afternoon Club. Mrs. Kennan was dressed in the Russian peasant holiday costume of red, white, and blue, heavily embroidered and woven with long necklaces of pearl beads. And so it goes on to say that she described some major Russian revolutionaries. She talked about her Russian photographs, her Russian travels. It said that, her lecture was a remarkable one. People loved it. It had a pretty good reception. And then they had a nice Russian tea afterwards, which is quite delightful. But that tells us a lot. It's really interesting because even in the official biography of George Kennan, which is written by a historian named Frederick Travis, and it was published in 1990. So it's almost 30 years. Yeah, it's almost 30 years old now. But he doesn't really mention Lena at all. And he definitely doesn't talk about the fact that she traveled and would dress up in a Russian peasant outfit, which is really interesting to me as well. So I think that's a really cool connection. It actually talks about here saying that they served Russian tea after the talk, and they decorated everything with black and yellow, which were the Russian national colors. So the Monday Afternoon Club, I think, had a good time and kind of did their thing here. There's actually a lot of descriptions of people coming to the Monday Afternoon Club during this time period and talking about Russia. So there's another lecture here that's from 1902. If you can see that here, it says a lecture on Russia by Mrs. Sears. Russia was just a place that people were really interested in part because it seemed like it was an up-and-coming kind of competitor with the United States. And then, of course, in 1904 and 1905, Russia actually had a war with Japan that they lost pretty badly. And George Kennan, this is a great story too. George Kennan actually was a war correspondent during that period, and he helped organize propaganda among Russian POWs in Japan, trying to revolutionize them and get them to go against the Tsar. He legitimately translated pamphlets, got all these things, and tried to get these Russian soldiers to kind of turn against their government while they were POWs in Japan from late 1904 to early 1905, which is a really interesting story as well. So that is about an hour. I could talk for about 4 more hours. So I hope that this has been interesting and not too dispersed. Not too kind of broad. So I did want to note a couple of things. So we are going to be doing another one of these. I'm not sure the date yet, but the book that I thought might be interesting to talk about next is African Game Trails by Theodore Roosevelt. We have that in our library too. It's a really beautiful, beautiful edition of this book. We've got, Teddy Roosevelt hasn't always aged super well because we got him over here standing on top of a lion corpse. But, that was kind of his thing. We can talk about his kind of masculinity a little bit if we wanted to. But I think this book was in 1910. Yeah, it's published in 1909. So Siberian Exile System was published in 1889 or 1891. 1891. This is 1909. I thought this one would be a fun one for our next go. I'm going to look and see if Amelia Earhart's one of her books is in our library collection, because she did come and talk to the club in 1935. And I thought that would be a good, a really interesting thing to discuss as well. If you have any preference or would like to kind of choose either way, feel free to leave a comment down below or to kind of message us on Facebook or get in contact with us on Instagram or via email or something like that. You can always send us an email at info@phelpsmansion.org. I do want to note that next week we have another event. It's actually not on a Saturday this time. It's on a Thursday because our house manager that whole weekend, he actually had something kind of come up. And so Joe is going to be going up into the attic, and I think he's going to take you in the basement. I'm not sure if the Wi-Fi works down there yet, but he's going to do a little behind the scenes tour. But that is going to be on Thursday, April 16th from 12 to 1 p.m. So that's a lunch break live stream, I guess you could call it. So again, that's a behind the scenes tour of the Phelps Mansion. We are still getting events set up for the remainder of April and into May. We, of course, are not sure how long everything's going to be closed down, but we're going to try to keep putting a lot of online things together in the meantime. If you guys enjoyed this talk, if you like the kind of paging through history format, please let me know. If you guys want to I guess you don't know what kind of books we own, but anyway, if you have any comments, please do share them with me. I would love to hear them. If you guys enjoyed this today and you'd like to leave a donation, you can check us out at phelpsmansion.org and click the Donate Now button. You'll see it right on the screen. That, of course, is not a necessity. We are super happy to just provide you guys some entertainment and some history and some education during this really difficult time. But if you feel so inclined, or if you want to become a member to help support us through this kind of difficult financial period, we would greatly appreciate that. But other than that, reminding you to donate, reminding you of what our next events are, I think that's all that I have left today. So again, I hope you guys enjoyed our kind of travel through the Siberian exile system a little bit. I would highly recommend you just take a look at the images from this. So I'm actually going to send you another link, because the Siberia and the Exile system is 2 volumes, and both of those are on Wikisource. So I just wanted to post those here in our live feed. Click on that, go through it. The pictures are beautiful. Go check out the Library of Congress images as well, because it's not just pictures of what you would think of as like stereotypically Russian things. There are a lot of kind of Central Asian people through here. So for example, this is a Kaczynski woman, which I guess is an indigenous kind of group, indigenous group in that region. Just really beautiful images by George Frost. And actually, there was a fire in his like library, or his kind of studio. There was a fire in his studio, so we actually lost a lot of these. And so some of these are the only place you can find them is in the book. So thank you guys again. It's 1 p.m., so I will not keep talking, but I hope that you guys enjoyed learning about George Kennan. If you get a chance to ever see his handwriting, it is a true gift. I just went to the archives. Bear with me, because I honestly think it's worth it to see this man's beautiful handwriting. Here we go. So I was just at the archives in January. I want you guys to look at this. I don't know if you can see that very well, but you hopefully get the basic understanding. It is the most beautiful, gorgeous, like, handwriting. Like, look at that. Ugh. As a historian, it's like, please have George Kennan write all documents that I need to read. Anyway, so thank you guys very much. I really appreciate it. I hope you guys have a great Saturday. I hope you have a wonderful Easter, Passover, or whatever you guys are celebrating. And thank you guys so much for tuning in. And we really appreciate your support of the Phelps. And we'll see you on Thursday with a behind the scenes tour with Joe, our house manager. Thank you so much.